Ruth Bellamy's son wanted her to sell the bee yard before the first bloom opened. At first, he said it gently, then louder. Then with the tired anger that only comes from loving someone who will not save herself. The roof was leaking over the back bedroom. Her medicine bottles stood in a crooked line beside the kitchen sink. The property tax notice sat unopened beneath a jar of buttons. And behind her house, 300 empty hives stood in uneven rows, facing the Almond Valley like little wooden coffins. "Mom," Daniel said, "there are no bees left." Ruth did not answer. She was looking past him, beyond the cracked porch rail, toward the old stone ditch her husband had built 40 years earlier, back when the valley still smelled like blossoms instead of chemicals. Everyone thought grief had made her stubborn. The neighbors called the hives useless. The growers called them ugly. The new pollination company called them a liability. Even Daniel, who still kissed her forehead before he left, had begun looking at that bee yard like it was a sickness she refused to cure. But Ruth knew one thing they did not. If almond blossoms opened without sound, if the white rose stood bright and silent under the morning sun, then the bees had not simply disappeared. They had gone where only an old beekeeper would think to look. And if Ruth was right, then the empty hives behind her house were not the saddest thing in the valley. They were the warning. If stories about forgotten people, old promises, and things the world was too quick to throw away mean something to you, consider subscribing. Because what happened next was not just about an old woman, an empty bee yard, or a dying almond crop. It was about the truth waiting underneath. The county agriculture meeting smelled of coffee, printer ink, and polished confidence. Ruth Bellamy sat in the third row with a black bee frame wrapped in an old flour sack on her lap. She wore her good gray sweater with the repaired cuff and pinned her white hair back the way Eli liked when they drove hives down the valley before sunrise. Daniel sat beside her, stiff and silent. A screen showed almond orchards in perfect pale rows beneath the blue and gold logo of Golden State Pollination Solutions. Trent Voss stood beside it in boots too clean for fieldwork. "This season," Trent said, "we are bringing in climate-controlled hive trailers, GPS-tracked placement routes, digital colony counters, and synchronized bloom window deployment." Ruth listened like she listened to a troubled hive. Not for what was loud, for what was missing. Trent clicked again. Refrigerated trucks. Aluminum ramps. White hive boxes stacked like merchandise. Orchard blocks in bright-colored zones. "Our model reduces loss," he said. "It eliminates guesswork. Most importantly, it moves this county beyond outdated pollination practices." Behind Ruth, someone whispered, "That means folks like her." Daniel's jaw tightened. Ruth did not turn. When the commissioner asked for public comments, Ruth rose slowly. Daniel reached for her sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, "please." But Ruth was already in the aisle. The room quieted in that polite, cruel way people do when they expect embarrassment. She walked to the microphone carrying the flour sack against her chest. The growers saw her patched boots, thin hands, and the old frame wrapped like something fragile. "My name is Ruth Bellamy," she said. The commissioner gave a thin smile. "We know you, Mrs. Bellamy." A few people chuckled. Ruth unfolded the flour sack and lifted the frame. It was not golden with honey. It was not moving with bees. It was old wood, dark comb, blackened wax, and a faint, bitter smell that made two men lean back. Trent glanced at it as if she had brought trash into a clean kitchen. "If you spray after dusk," Ruth said, "you'll confuse the bees before they find the rose. They won't settle right. They'll drift low, circle wrong, and by the second week, blossoms will start dropping before they set." Trent smiled. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, "our schedule is based on atmospheric data, bloom progression, and colony movement modeling." Ruth looked at him. "Does your model know what wax remembers?" A laugh broke from the left side of the room. Daniel stared down at his hands. Trent stepped closer to the microphone. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, louder now, "you don't even have bees anymore." This time, the room laughed harder. Ruth stood still. Nobody saw her thumb press into the frame. Nobody saw Eli in her face. The shed. Smoke in morning light. Thousands of wings moving like one breath. Then the sound disappeared. "No," Ruth said softly. The laughter thinned. She looked at Trent, the growers, and Commissioner Marla Greer with a closed county folder. "You made sure of that." The room went cold. Marla straightened. "Mrs. Bellamy, accusations are not appropriate in this setting." "It's not an accusation," Ruth said. "It's a warning." Trent breathed through his nose. "A warning based on what?" An empty frame? Ruth looked down at the black wax. You're listening to trucks, she said. I'm listening for silence. No one laughed at that. Then Len Farrow, the county inspector, stood near the wall with a clipboard. Since Mrs. Bellamy has brought up her bee yard, he said, the county has received complaints about abandoned agricultural equipment, pest risk, and unsafe structures on her property. Daniel's head snapped up. Len avoided Ruth's eyes. A formal notice will be delivered this week. If the site is not cleared, repaired, or transferred to an active agricultural operator, the county may classify it as an abandoned hazard. The words landed harder than laughter. Cleared, repaired, transferred. Ruth knew what transferred meant. Sold hives. Filled ditches. A mistake buried before it had time to show itself. Daniel leaned close. Mom, we can't fight the county. Ruth folded the black frame back into the flour sack. Outside, almond trees were beginning to bloom. White flowers opened by the thousands, bright, fragile, and, if Ruth was not wrong, too quiet. She walked out without another word. Daniel followed her into the sun while the growers returned to charts, contracts, and a system that had never once listened to an old hive. At the edge of the lot, Ruth stopped as a Golden State pollination truck rolled toward the valley road. Daniel looked at it, then at her. Please, he said, just sell before this gets worse. Ruth watched the truck disappear between blooming rows. It already got worse, she said. They just haven't heard it yet. Ruth Bellamy had not been born into bees. She had married into them. The first time Eli Bellamy took her to a holding yard before sunrise, she was 22 and still afraid of anything with wings. The hives sat in white rows under a cold February moon, each box humming so softly that Ruth mistook it for power lines. Eli laughed when she asked where the sound came from. Not from above, he said. From inside. He lifted the lid of one hive with the care of a man opening a church door. Warm air rose into the morning. Ruth smelled wax, smoke, honey, dust, and something green she could not name. Then the bees moved all at once, not wildly, not angrily, but like a single thought passing through thousands of bodies. That was the first time she understood why Eli never called them insects. He called them weather with wings. In those days, Bellamy Bees was small enough to fit behind one flatbed truck. Eli drove. Ruth kept the ledger. They followed Bloom from orchard to orchard, sleeping in cheap motels and waking before dawn to move colonies while the air was still cool. Ruth learned to read more than numbers. She learned the difference between a hive that was hungry and a hive that was frightened. She learned that 1 acre of healthy blossoms could sound different from the next. By the time Daniel was born, Ruth could stand beside a row of hives and tell Eli which one had lost its queen. Eli built the stone ditch the summer Daniel turned 5. Everyone else called it drainage. That was partly true. The north edge of their land held water after spring rain, and growers complained that Ruth and Eli's yard attracted weeds and mud. Eli hauled limestone by hand from an old wash, stacking it into a shallow channel that curved behind the bee yard before disappearing into dry grass. But he did more than drain water. He planted mint and wild mustard near the stones. He left pockets between rocks where cool air stayed after sunset. He set the hives facing east because the first morning light crossed the ditch before it touched the orchard rows. Bees remember a path by more than sight, he told Ruth. Heat, scent, shade, moisture. You give them a road, they'll use it longer than men use pavement. Ruth teased him for speaking like that. But she never moved the hives. For years, the valley trusted people like Eli. Growers called him before they called consultants. They asked when to open water, when to cut cover crop, when to delay spray. Eli never made anyone feel foolish. He would remove his hat, look at the trees, smell the air, and say what the bees had already told him. Then, the new chemicals came. At first, nobody called them dangerous. They called them efficient, cleaner, more targeted, better for yield. The salesman brought laminated charts and free dinners at the Grange Hall. A few old beekeepers complained about drift, but the complaints sounded small beside the numbers. One March evening, Ruth watched Eli come home after checking the south blocks. He did not wash his hands. He did not take off his boots. He stood in the doorway of the bee shed and listened. "What is it?" Ruth asked. He shook his head. The next morning, 20 colonies were wrong. Not dead. Not yet. Wrong. Bees crawled outside the entrances as if they had forgotten where inside was. Foragers lifted, circled low, then dropped in the grass. Some returned to the wrong boxes. Some never returned. By the end of that week, the holding yard sounded thin. By the end of that month, Ruth could hear spaces between the hives where sound used to be solid. Eli began writing everything down. Temperature, wind, spray hours, orchard block, hive direction, loss count, flight pattern, names of growers, names of men who said they had followed label instructions. He drove to the county office with a folder under his arm and came back without it. Ruth asked what happened. They said they'll look into it, he told her. But his voice did not sound like a man who believed that. Other beekeepers started losing colonies too. Amos Reed lost half his. The Gutierrez brothers sold their truck. A widow from Danuba auctioned her boxes for less than lumber. At meetings, officials called it stress, mites, weather, poor management, bad luck. Every explanation pointed everywhere except the orchards. Bellamy bees shrank one row at a time. Ruth watched Eli change with it. He still woke before dawn, still checked the stone ditch, still repaired hive lids, still rubbed wax between his fingers and smelled it. But he stopped singing in the shed. He stopped taking Daniel with him on short routes. He stopped telling growers what the bees had said. Daniel noticed everything. He was old enough to carry empty supers, young enough to believe a father's silence meant anger. He began to hate the bee yard because it took Eli away even when Eli was standing right there. He hated the bills folded under the sugar jar. He hated the nights Ruth whispered behind the bedroom door. Most of all, he hated the smell of smoke in his father's clothes because it meant another day spent trying to save something that kept dying. Years later, Daniel would remember that season as the year his childhood became quiet. Ruth remembered it differently. She remembered Eli building the back wall of the ditch higher, stone by stone, after the worst losses had already come. She remembered asking him why he was still working on a place that no longer had bees enough to use it. He had answered without looking at her, because silence comes around again. Not long after that, Eli got sick. The doctors called it his heart, though Ruth believed grief had taken the first piece. Hospital rooms made him look smaller than any field ever had. His hands, once steady enough to lift a queen from a frame, trembled against the sheet. On the last clear afternoon before he died, he asked Ruth to open the window. The almond trees beyond the hospital parking lot were in bloom. No bees reached that high. But Eli listened anyway. Then he took Ruth's hand. "If the almond trees ever bloom without sound," he whispered, "don't let them take the hives." Ruth bent close, waiting for more. There was more in his face. She saw it. Fear, shame, love, something he had carried too long, but he only said, "Promise me." So Ruth promised. After the funeral, neighbors told her to sell the equipment before it rotted. Growers stopped calling. Daniel left for work in Fresno and came home only when the roof leaked, the taxes rose, or his mother scared him by pretending she was fine. The hives stayed, 300 empty boxes in crooked rows. To Daniel, they were proof that grief had trapped his mother in the year Eli died. To Ruth, they were the last sentence of a warning her husband had not lived long enough to finish. By the next morning, the notice was taped to Ruth Bellamy's front gate. Daniel found it first. He had come early with a toolbox, a sack of groceries, and the quiet apology he had not yet figured out how to say. The county envelope was folded inside a plastic sleeve, zip-tied to the wire, where Eli had once hung a hand-painted sign that read, "Bellamy Bees Keep Gate Closed." Daniel stood there reading until Ruth came out onto the porch in her house slippers. "What is it?" she asked. He did not answer right away. That told her enough. The notice used clean words for ugly things. Non-compliant structures, abandoned equipment, pest risk, corrective action required. It gave Ruth 30 days to remove, repair, or transfer the bee yard to an approved agricultural operator. 30 days, the same amount of time almond bloom could take to make or break a valley. Ruth folded the paper once and tucked it into her sweater pocket. Daniel watched her do it. "You can't just put that away like a church bulletin." I read it. "They're serious this time." So Behind her, the bee yard stood in the pale morning. 300 hives, some white, some gray, some weathered down to raw wood, sat in rows that no longer looked straight to anyone but Ruth. A few lids had warped. A few boxes leaned where the ground had settled. The grass had grown high between them. To Daniel, it looked like neglect. To Len Farrow, The county inspector, who arrived 20 minutes later with a camera around his neck, it looked like evidence. He walked the fence line taking photographs. Click. A cracked hive lid. Click. A stack of empty supers under a tarp. Click. A rusted smoker hanging from a nail beside the shed. Click. The old stone ditch behind the hives, half hidden by mustard, mint, dry grass, and fallen leaves. Len was not cruel. That almost made it worse. He spoke in a careful voice, like a man trying not to step on a grave. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, checking a form, "if these boxes are inactive, they have to be cleared or brought up to standard. The county can't ignore complaints indefinitely." "Who complained?" Len glanced toward Daniel, then away. "Several parties." "Growers?" "Some." "Golden State Pollination?" He did not answer. Ruth smiled without warmth. "That means yes." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Mom, please don't start." But Ruth had already walked into the first row of hives. She placed one hand on the nearest box. The wood was rough beneath her palm. The paint had peeled so badly that only a faint line of white remained along the corner. A blackened entrance slit cut across the bottom board. To anyone else, it was empty. A dead box. A bad memory with nails in it. Ruth saw more. She saw the way Eli had turned that row 2 inches east after the freeze of '89. She saw where he had replaced one side panel with pine because the original cedar held spray smell too long. She saw propolis, dark as old tea, along the inner seam. She saw a frame mark burned into the corner. RB12. The first hive Daniel had helped paint when he was 9. These boxes were not abandoned. They were a map. Every row faced the morning light at a slightly different angle. Every entrance pointed toward a path bees had used year after year. The old wax held scent. The old wood held heat. Even empty, they still told the valley where home had been. Len lifted his camera again. "Don't photograph that one," Ruth said. He lowered it. "Why?" "Because you don't know what you're looking at," Daniel exhaled sharply. "Mom." Before Len could answer, a truck turned in at the gate. It was black, clean, and too new for Ruth's road. Golden State Pollination Solutions was printed on the door. Trent Voss stepped out wearing sunglasses and a field vest that had never met real burrs. He looked at the notice in Daniel's hand and gave a sympathetic nod. "Rough morning," he said. Ruth did not move. Trent walked to the fence as if he owned the idea of standing there. "Mrs. Bellamy, I know yesterday got tense. I'd like to make this easier before it becomes a county problem." "It already is a county problem," Ruth said. "That's why you're here." His smile held. "Your land sits in a useful position, close to 3 major almond blocks. Good access road. Enough flat ground for staging trailers. We would be willing to lease it, or buy it outright, above assessed value." Daniel looked up. Ruth noticed. Trent noticed too. "We'd clear the old equipment at our expense," Trent continued. "You wouldn't have to deal with fines, liability, maintenance, any of it." Ruth looked behind him at the hives. "And the boxes? They're empty." "That wasn't my question." Trent removed his sunglasses. "They would be removed. And the ditch? We'd grade what we need for trailer access." Daniel's eyes moved from Trent to Ruth. She could see the numbers working in his head. Roof, medicine, taxes, 30 days. Above, assessed value. For a moment, Ruth hated the offer not because it was insulting, but because it was useful. That was the kind of temptation that made a person feel old. She walked past Trent and stood at the edge of the stone ditch. The ditch did not look like much. A shallow curve of limestone and weeds. Most of the stones had sunk halfway into the soil. Mint grew between them because Eli had planted it there, and because mint, like grief, did not ask permission to spread. Trent followed her gaze. "With respect," he said, "there's nothing there worth preserving." Ruth crouched slowly. Her knee hurt, but she did not let Daniel help her. She touched the cool stone. "Eli used to say the valley forgot everything that didn't come with a receipt." Trent gave a polite laugh. "I deal in results, Mrs. Bellamy." So did he. A small movement cut across the corner of Ruth's eye. She stilled. At first, she thought it was dust. Then it came again. A single bee. It moved low over the grass, heavy and uncertain, not like the strong foragers Ruth remembered from the old days. It landed on the edge of one black hive entrance, touched the wood, and lifted again. Daniel saw it too. His expression changed before he could hide it. The bee did not fly toward the orchard. It turned toward the stone ditch. Ruth followed it with her eyes until it disappeared between two limestone rocks where the mint grew thickest. No one spoke. Len held his camera halfway raised. Trent's smile had finally weakened. Daniel took one step closer to the ditch. Was that? Ruth stood, very slowly. It was early, she said. Early for what? For them to be showing themselves. Trent recovered first. A feral bee doesn't prove anything. No, Ruth said, looking at the stones. But it tells me where to start. The wind moved through the empty hives behind her. To everyone else, they were still dead boxes waiting to be cleared. But Ruth Bellamy had just seen one living thing return to a road her husband had built 40 years earlier. And for the first time since the county meeting, Daniel did not ask her to sell. He only looked at the ditch, then at the hives, then back at his mother, as if the thing he had called grief might have been something else all along. Ruth waited until the next morning to test what she had seen. She rose before Daniel's truck came up the road, before the sun broke clean over the eastern ridge, before the almond rose turned white enough to hurt the eyes. The valley was still blue with cold. In the kitchen, she warmed yesterday's coffee and set 2 slices of bread in the toaster, then forgot them there until the smell of burning brought her back from the window. Outside, the empty hives waited. The single bee from the day before had not been proof. Ruth knew that. One bee could be a wanderer. One bee could be nothing more than a survivor lost between seasons. One bee could fool an old woman who wanted too badly to hear a sound that had been gone for years. So she did what Eli would have done. She started with a frame. From the shed wall, Ruth chose a narrow bait frame dark with old wax and propolis. She held it near her face, closed her eyes, and breathed through it slowly. The smell was bitter, smoky, almost medicinal. Underneath it was something softer. Almond, mint, old heat. She wrapped the frame in cloth, tucked Eli's notebook under one arm, and walked the back road to Carson Orchards. Harold Carson had known Eli before Golden State pollination came into the valley. He was 71, broad-shouldered, and tired in the way growers became tired when the bank knew the weather before they did. His granddaughter Lily found Ruth first, standing near the packing shed. "Mrs. Bellamy?" Lily said. "Grandpa's with the spray crew. That's what I came about." Lily looked toward the wrapped frame. "Is that from your hives? What's left of them?" Harold came out of the shed wiping his hands on a rag. He smiled when he saw Ruth, but the smile weakened when he noticed the notebook. "Ruth," he said, "if this is about last night's meeting, it's about tonight's spray." His face closed a little. She opened Eli's notebook to a page marked with his old red pencil. "Wind after dusk, north edge drift. Return loss by morning." She explained it plainly, without accusation. "Stop spraying after dusk for 3 nights. Let the imported bees settle to the orchard before chemical scent cross the rows. Watch the bloom nearest the ditch. Compare it with the south block." Harold listened. Lily listened harder. Then Harold looked toward the trucks parked beyond the shed. "I already signed the treatment schedule," he said. "Schedules can change. Not this one. Golden State bundled pollination with spray timing. If I change the window, I lose the service guarantee." Ruth lowered the notebook. "You trust a guarantee more than a field?" "I trust what I can afford to lose," Harold said quietly. That hurt because it was honest. Before Ruth could answer, a white Golden State pickup rolled beside the shed. Trent Voss stepped out with 2 technicians and a tablet in his hand. "Well," he said, seeing Ruth, "we're getting quite the field consultation this morning." Lily looked embarrassed. Harold looked trapped. Ruth did not move. Trent walked close enough to see the bait frame in her hand. "Are we bringing antiques into active orchard management now?" One technician laughed. Ruth turned the frame so the sun touched the black wax. "Put this near the north rows tonight. If the bees are drifting, they'll touch this before they touch the trailer boxes." Trent glanced at Harold. "Mr. Carson, you're welcome to humor local tradition, but I should remind you that unapproved attractants can interfere with our monitoring." "It's wax," Ruth said. "It's uncontrolled wax," Trent replied. The words sounded so foolish that Lily nearly smiled. But Harold did not. His crop was worth too much. His debt was too real. "I'm sorry, Ruth," he said. She nodded once. That afternoon, Trent held a demonstration in Block 14, where the almond blossoms were thick and white. Growers gathered along the access road while Golden State technicians opened the rear of a climate-controlled trailer. Fresh hive boxes sat stacked inside, clean and bright. A digital counter blinked near the door. On Trent's tablet, colored dots moved across a field map. Real-time colony movement, he announced. No guessing. No folklore. No standing in the dirt hoping the bees tell you a secret. A few growers laughed. Daniel stood at the edge of the crowd with his arms folded. Ruth had not asked him to come, but he had come anyway. Maybe to help. Maybe to stop her. Maybe because the single bee at the ditch had disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. Trente gave a signal. The technicians opened the hive entrances. Bees poured out into the bright afternoon. For a moment, the sound lifted beautifully. Even Ruth felt it in her chest. A living hum. A promise. Then she watched closer. The bees rose, circled, and spread unevenly over the first row of blossoms. Some settled, some did not. Along the north side, a thin stream drifted low, moving sideways instead of forward. They crossed over the bare road, hovered near a treated ditch bank, then scattered. Ruth stepped toward Daniel. "Do you see that?" He squinted. "See what?" "They're not taking the row." Trent heard her. Of course he did. "Mrs. Bellamy," he called. "Bees are not church choirs. They don't perform in straight lines." The growers laughed again, though not all of them. Ruth pointed toward the north edge. "They're avoiding that scent pocket." One of the technicians shook his head. "Wind shift." "There is no wind." "Microcurrent," Trent said smoothly. Ruth looked at him. "That's a nice word for not knowing." The laughter stopped for half a second. Then Harold Carson, trying to calm things down, said, "Ruth, maybe let them finish." Daniel touched her elbow. "Mom." She pulled away, not sharply, but enough. All evening, Ruth waited until the crews left. Near dusk, she took her bait frame to the edge of the old stone ditch behind her own bee yard and set it between two flat rocks where mint grew thickest. She marked the spot with a cedar twig and sat on an overturned bucket until the sky went purple. For a while, nothing came. Then one bee. Then two. Then a third that circled the frame, touched the wax, and disappeared into the stones. Ruth's breath caught. She reached for Eli's notebook, ready to mark the time. That was when the rain started. Not a gentle rain. A hard spring burst that came down without warning, drumming against the hive lids, flattening the mint, washing scent off stone. Ruth grabbed the frame, but too late. Water ran black over the wax and into the dirt. The cedar twig floated away. By the time Daniel found her, she was standing in the rain with the ruined frame in both hands. "Mom," he said, rushing toward her, "what are you doing out here?" She looked past him at the ditch. For 1 hour, maybe less. She had almost had proof. Now she had wet wax, 3 marks in a notebook, and a story no one would believe. Daniel took off his jacket and put it over her shoulders. For once, he did not scold her, but from the road, headlights slowed. A Golden State pickup rolled past the gate. Trent sat behind the wheel. He did not stop. He only looked at Ruth standing in the rain beside the empty hives. By morning, half the valley would hear that the old widow had been outside in a storm, trying to catch bees with a rotten frame. And for the first time in years, Ruth Bellamy wondered whether a warning could die simply because no one would believe the person carrying it. The story spread faster than Ruth expected. By noon the next day, 2 growers had already slowed their trucks near her gate, not to ask questions, but to look. One of them did not even pretend. He leaned forward over his steering wheel, stared at the empty hives, then drove on with the half-smile of a man who had found something to repeat at lunch. By evening, Daniel had heard it too. "They're saying you were out in the rain trying to trap bees with rotten wax." Ruth stood at the kitchen sink, washing mud from the bait frame. The wax had gone dull and soft around the edges. Rainwater had carried away most of the scent. "I wasn't trapping them. That's not the part people care about." She set the frame on a towel. Daniel looked tired. Not angry this time. Tired. That made the room feel smaller. "Mom," he said, "if you keep doing this, Trent won't even have to fight you. People will decide you're not well." Ruth dried her hands slowly. "People already decided that. That doesn't mean you have to help them." She looked through the kitchen window toward the bee yard. Morning light touched the tops of the hives. Beyond them, too quiet. For 2 days after the rain, Ruth did not argue with anyone. She did not go back to Carson Orchards. She did not call the county. She did not speak Trent's name. She listened. That was the part no one understood. Listening was work. It meant waking before dawn and standing still while the cold moved under your collar. It meant hearing the difference between a healthy orchard and a pretty one. A pretty orchard could fool a camera. A healthy one could not fool the air. On the third morning, Ruth walked the north edge of Carson's lower block before the crews arrived. She had permission from Harold, though she suspected he had given it mostly because guilt was cheaper than courage. The blossoms looked full from the road. Up close, they told another story. Under several trees, petals lay scattered in pale drifts, not soft and natural, but early, too early. Ruth picked one flower from the ground and split it gently with her thumbnail. The center had not set right. The promise had failed before it became fruit. She marked the tree with a strip of blue cloth. Then another. Then another. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, 6 trees near the treated ditch bank carried blue cloth on their lower branches. A voice behind her said, "Are they sick?" Ruth turned. Lily Carson stood there in rubber boots, holding a paper cup of coffee in both hands. She looked younger than Ruth had remembered from the packing shed. 19, maybe 20. Old enough to know fear, young enough to still be angry when adults lied politely. "They're not sick," Ruth said. "They missed their chance." Lily looked toward the rows. "Grandpa says Golden State told him it's weather stress. Weather doesn't drop blossoms in a straight line." Lily followed Ruth's gaze. The blue strips did not scatter randomly through the block. They curved along the north edge, toward Ruth's land. "Can I film that?" Lily asked. Ruth hesitated. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because once you point a camera at something, people stop looking at the thing. They start looking for who to blame." Lily seemed to understand, or at least respected the shape of the answer. Together, they walked the edge of the orchard toward Ruth's old stone ditch. The morning had warmed just enough for scent to rise from the ground. Wet mint, limestone, almond petals, a faint chemical sharpness Ruth tasted more than smelled. Then she heard it. Not the full sound of a working hive. Not even close. It was smaller than that. A thread of sound beneath the grass. So faint that Ruth stopped breathing to keep from covering it. Lily stopped too. "What?" Ruth lifted one hand. The sound came again. A thin, living vibration from between the stones. Ruth lowered herself carefully to her knees beside the ditch. Her fingers parted mint and dead grass. At first she saw only shadow, then a movement, then another. Bees. Not many. A small cluster, tucked deep where 2 limestone slabs leaned together. Their bodies were darker than the imported bees from Golden State's trailers. Smaller, too. They moved slowly in the cool, but they were alive. Lily crouched beside her. "Oh my God," she whispered. Ruth closed her eyes for a second. Not to pray. To keep from crying before she understood what she was seeing. The bees were not living in the empty hives. They were not living in the orchard. They had found shelter in the old stone ditch, in the pockets Eli had left between rocks, in the cool seams that held scent after dusk and heat after cold nights. Daniel arrived 10 minutes later because Lily had called him before Ruth could stop her. He came across the field in work boots, and a jacket thrown over his shirt, breathing hard. "What happened?" Lily pointed at the stones. "Look." Daniel crouched, impatient at first, then still. One bee crawled out from the crack, touched the edge of a mint leaf, and lifted into the air. It did not fly toward the Golden State trailers parked beyond Carson's shed. It flew low along the ditch, crossed the fence gap, and landed on the entrance board of one of Ruth's old hives. Daniel started. The bee walked across the blackened wood like it knew the place. Then it rose again and turned toward the nearest almond row. Ruth watched Daniel's face change. Not belief. Not yet. But the first break in disbelief. "How many?" he asked. "Enough to be alive," Ruth said. "Not enough to save a valley." Lily had tears in her eyes. "But they came back." Ruth looked at the ditch, then at the hives. "No," she said softly. "They never fully left." That afternoon, Ruth opened Eli's notebook on the kitchen table. Daniel stood behind her, arms folded, saying nothing. Lily sat opposite with her phone turned face down, as if she had agreed to enter Ruth's slower world for a little while. Page after page showed the old measurements Eli had taken after the collapse. Ditch temp at dusk. Wax scent holds longer after rain. North edge drift strongest when spray follows sunset. Hive row still draws survivors east. Ruth turned another page. There, written in Eli's cramped hand, was a line she did not remember seeing before. Ditch temperature holds scent after dusk. If bloom goes quiet, check the stones before the boxes. Daniel read it twice. His hand moved to the back of Ruth's chair, but he did not touch her. Dad knew they were there? Ruth looked at the words until they blurred. He suspected. That's different from telling you. Yes, Ruth said, and there it was, small but sharp. The first crack in the story she had told herself about Eli. Not enough to break it. Not yet. But enough to let cold air through. Outside, beyond the window, a Golden State truck slowed near the gate, then kept moving. Ruth closed the notebook. We need proof no one can wash away. Daniel did not argue. Lily picked up her phone. This time, she said carefully, can we film? Ruth looked toward the hives, the ditch, the almond rose losing blossoms too early. Then she nodded, but only once, because proof was a dangerous thing. Once you had it, you had to decide who you were willing to hurt with it. They started before sunrise because Ruth said bees told the truth before people had time to interfere. Daniel brought a flashlight, a pair of work gloves, and the same doubtful silence he had carried since Lily called him to the ditch. He had not apologized. He had not said he believed her, but he had come back, and for Ruth, that was the first honest thing he had done in days. Lily arrived with her phone, a notebook, and a roll of blue survey tape. I charged 2 batteries, she said. Ruth almost smiled. Then don't waste them filming my shoes. The old stone ditch lay behind the bee yard, half buried in grass, mint, and years of being ignored. In morning shadow, it looked even smaller than it had the day before. Just a shallow curve of limestone, no wider than a feed trough in places, running along the north edge of Ruth's land before bending toward Carson Orchards. Daniel stood over it with the flashlight. I used to jump over this when I was a kid, he said. You used to fall in it when you were showing off, Ruth said. He gave her a look, but there was no anger in it. Together, they began clearing the first section. Ruth would not let them pull the mint by the roots. Eli had planted it for a reason. Instead, Daniel cut the tall grass with hand shears, while Lily tied blue tape to every place Ruth told her not to step. Beneath the brush, the ditch slowly appeared. It was not one channel. That was the first thing Daniel noticed. At the surface, the stones formed a simple curve, but underneath, where the grass had hidden the edges, smaller stone pockets branched away from the main line. Some were no bigger than a cupped hand. Others ran under the soil like little chambers, roofed with flat pieces of limestone. Daniel knelt and aimed the flashlight into one. Mum. Ruth lowered herself beside him. Inside the stone pocket, the walls were dark with old wax smears. Not much. Not enough for anyone careless to notice. But enough. Lily leaned in, filming. Did your husband build these? Ruth touched the edge of the limestone. He built the ditch. That's not what I asked. Ruth did not answer right away, because Lily was right. Eli had not only stacked stones to move water, he had left cavities. Cool pockets. Small protected seams where scent could hold after the sun dropped and where a frightened bee could wait out wind, spray, cold, or confusion. He had built a road that also knew how to become a shelter. Daniel moved to the next section. There's another one, then another, and another. By the time the sun reached the top of the hives, they had marked 23 stone pockets along the ditch. Ruth sat back on her heels, breathing hard. Her hands were muddy, her knees ached, but her eyes kept moving from stone to hive to orchard, measuring a map she had lived beside for 40 years and still had not fully seen. Eli had hidden the truth in plain sight. Or maybe he had trusted that she would know where to look when the time came. Ruth was no longer sure which one hurt more. At 8:17, the first bee emerged. Lily whispered the time like she was in church. The bee crawled from one of the stone pockets, cleaned its front legs, and lifted into the low light. It did not rise high. It followed the ditch line, touched the entrance board of Hive 12, circled once, then crossed the fence toward the almond trees. Another came 2 minutes later. Then 3 from a different pocket. Then a small stream from a shadowed seam near the mint. Not a swarm, not a commercial colony, not enough to fill a grower's dream, but enough to prove the ditch was not dead. Lily filmed from a distance, careful not to block the flight path. Daniel stood beside Ruth, with his arms hanging loose at his sides. They're using the hives, he said. No, Ruth said. They're using what the hives remember. By mid-morning, Lily's video had reached her grandfather. By noon, Harold Carson had walked the ditch himself. He did not say much. He stood with his hat in both hands, watching bees move from Stone Pocket to Old Hive to Almond Row. The longer he watched, the less he looked like a man protecting a contract, and the more he looked like a boy who had been caught believing the wrong adult. "I should have listened to Eli back then," he said. Ruth looked at him sharply. "Back when?" Harold swallowed. "When the first losses came, he said the bees were being turned around. Not killed outright. Turned around." Before Ruth could ask more, 2 more growers arrived. Then a third. Someone had shown them Lily's video. Someone else had already sent it to a group chat Ruth had never been invited to. By late afternoon, there were 8 trucks parked along the road. Ruth hated the crowd almost as much as she had hated the laughter. Len Farrow came too, still wearing his county badge, but this time he did not bring the camera to collect violations. He brought 2 sample jars and a folded request form. "Commissioner Greer wants activity samples," he said. "For what purpose?" Ruth asked. Len looked uncomfortable. "To determine whether there's enough evidence to pause enforcement on the notice." Daniel turned to Ruth. "That's good." "Maybe," Ruth said, because she had lived long enough to know that when the county paused one hand, the other hand was often reaching for a different tool. They collected pollen from 3 places: the old ditch, the Golden State trailer block, and the north edge of Carson Orchards, where blossoms had begun to drop. Lily labeled each jar. Harold signed as witness. Daniel signed too, after a hesitation so small Ruth might have missed it if she had not raised him. The preliminary lab call came the next morning. Marla Greer put it on speaker in Harold's packing shed, with Ruth, Daniel, Lily, Len, Trent Voss, and 6 growers standing around a scarred wooden table. The county technician's voice crackled through the phone. "Pollen transfer activity is significantly higher along the Bellamy north boundary than in the monitored trailer block. We are not saying why yet, but the difference is measurable." The room went still. For 3 seconds, no one moved. Ruth looked at the growers who had laughed at her black wax frame. Most of them would not meet her eyes. Harold took off his cap. Daniel stared at the phone like it had spoken in his father's voice. Then Trent Voss laughed. Not loudly, just enough. "Let's be careful," he said. "Feral bee activity near unmanaged equipment does not equal a scalable pollination solution." Lily's face flushed. "You saw the video." "I saw bees," Trent said. "I did not see proof that Mrs. Bellamy's property can support commercial pollination. I also saw multiple unregulated cavities near agricultural production, which raises biosecurity questions." There it was. Ruth felt it before he finished. If he could not call the ditch useless anymore, he would call it dangerous. Len shifted his weight. Marla Greer looked from Trent to Ruth, then down at the lab note in front of her. For the first time since the county meeting, she seemed unsure which side of the table was safer. Ruth placed Eli's notebook beside the sample jars. "You called my hives abandoned," she said. "You called my warning folklore. Now the bees are moving where I said they'd move, from the stones to the rows." Trent's jaw tightened. "That still does not explain why." "No," Ruth said. "It doesn't." And that was the truth. The room had changed, but the deepest door had not opened yet. They had proof that Ruth was not crazy. They had proof that the ditch was alive. They had proof that something about the company's clean model had missed what Eli's old stones still held. But Ruth could feel a darker question waiting behind all of it. If Eli had built a refuge this carefully, if he had written down drift patterns this precisely, if he had known that silence could come around again, why had he left Ruth with a promise instead of the whole truth? That evening, after the growers left and the sample jars were taken to the county office, Ruth returned to the bee shed alone. The sun had dropped behind the almond rows. The empty hives glowed pale in the last light. From the stone ditch came a sound so faint most people would have walked past it. Ruth opened Eli's notebook again. This time, she did not read the pages about bees. She looked at the inside back cover, where the cardboard had bubbled slightly with age. For 40 years, she had thought it was water damage. Now she pressed her thumb against the seam. Something crackled underneath. The paper hidden inside Eli's notebook was not a report. Not yet. It was a receipt. Ruth worked it loose from the bubbled cardboard with the tip of a butter knife, careful not to tear the brittle fold. The paper had yellowed around the edges, and the ink had faded to the soft blue of old bruises. At the top was a name Ruth had not seen in years. Valley Agricultural Assurance Office. Below it, in Eli's handwriting, was a short note. "Tin box. South shelf. Don't open unless the quiet comes back." Ruth read it 3 times. Then she sat down on the wooden stool beside the workbench, because her knees had gone weak for reasons that had nothing to do with age. The south shelf had not been touched in years. It held broken feeders, old queen cages, a coffee can full of rusted nails, and Eli's last smoker, the one Ruth could never bring herself to clean. Behind a stack of warped hive lids, her fingers found metal, a small tin box, green once, now mostly rust. Locked, Ruth carried it to the kitchen just as Daniel came in through the back door, still wearing the dust of the orchard on his boots. "What's that?" "I don't know yet." But she did. Not the contents, not the details. She knew the feeling of it. A thing kept too long. A thing waiting for the person who loved the dead enough to forgive them, but not enough to keep lying for them. Daniel stared at the box. "Was it Dad's?" Ruth nodded. Before either of them could speak again, a black SUV turned into the drive. Trent Voss stepped out first. Behind him came a woman in a navy suit, carrying a leather folder. Daniel recognized her before Ruth did. She had been in the Golden State trailer block during the demonstration, standing behind the technicians without saying a word. Trent smiled like a man arriving with help. "Mrs. Bellamy," he called. "Do you have a minute?" "No," Ruth said. He kept walking anyway. The woman introduced herself as Carla Mead, Regional Counsel for Golden State Pollination Solutions. She did not look at the hives when she spoke. She looked at the house, the sagging porch, the roof patch Daniel had never finished, the old truck with one tire low. Lawyers, Ruth thought, were trained to see weakness before facts. "We'd like to resolve this cooperatively," Carla said. She opened the folder on Ruth's kitchen table. Inside was an offer. Daniel saw the number first. His hand tightened on the back of a chair. Ruth did not reach for the paper. Carla explained it calmly. Golden State would purchase the B-yard parcel above assessed value. They would cover county compliance costs. They would repair the front roof as part of a hardship accommodation. They would allow Ruth to remain in the house for 5 years, under a life-use clause. In return, Golden State would assume management of the ditch and surrounding hive area as a controlled pollination research site. "And," Ruth said, looking at the last page, "I signed this." Carla folded her hands. "A standard confidentiality agreement." Daniel looked from the paper to his mother. "Mom," he said quietly, "that's more than the land is worth." Ruth looked at him then. She did not blame him. That made it worse. She could see the roof in his face. The medicine bottles. The tax notice. The years he had spent coming home to patch what she refused to let go. This offer did not sound like greed to Daniel. It sounded like relief. Trent leaned forward. "You would be helping the valley. We have the resources to study the site properly. You called it a biosecurity risk yesterday. That is why it needs professional management." Ruth touched the tin box in her lap. Carla noticed. "What is that?" "Mine. Is it related to the site?" Ruth smiled faintly. "Everything in this house is related to the site." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be." Ruth felt the words enter her like cold water. Carla slid the offer closer. "You have 30 days under county notice," she said. "Possibly less if liability concerns increase. If people continue entering the property to film or collect samples, the county may restrict access for safety reasons. And Golden State would help with that restriction?" Carla did not answer. She did not need to. After they left, Daniel stayed in the kitchen. The offer lay between him and Ruth. For a long time, neither touched it. Finally, he said, "Do you know what that money would do?" "Yes." "Do you?" Ruth looked at him. Daniel's voice broke before it rose. "It would fix the roof. It would pay the county. It would pay for your heart medicine without me checking prices every month like some kind of coward. It would let you stop proving things to people who don't care if you live or die as long as their trees set fruit." Ruth looked down at Eli's tin box. "And if I sign? Then you live." The sentence hung there. Outside, the hives stood in rows, pale and patient. Ruth wanted to say that living was not the same as surviving. She wanted to say that some promises cost more than a roof. But Daniel was her son, not a sermon, and he had paid enough for the silence of his parents. So she said the truer thing. "I don't know what your father left me." Daniel wiped his face with one hand, angry at himself for showing anything. "Then open it." The key was not in the house. They searched the desk, the bedroom drawer, the old coffee tin where Ruth kept spare buttons, the cigar box of bee tags, the cracked mug full of Allen wrenches. Nothing. At dusk, Lily arrived at the gate and called before entering, because Ruth had asked her not to surprise the bees. She brought news. Golden State filed a site concern with the county, she said. Grandpa heard it from Len. They're saying uncontrolled feral colonies near commercial orchards could spread disease. Daniel swore under his breath. Ruth did not. Anger would come later. First came clarity. If the ditch belonged to no one, they would call it unsafe. If it worked, they would call it theirs. If it held proof, they would try to close it before proof learned how to speak. Lily saw the tin box on the table. What is that? Something Eli didn't want opened too early, Ruth said. Lily stepped closer. Or something he was afraid to open himself. Daniel looked at her sharply, but Ruth did not, because the girl had said what Ruth had been trying not to think. That night, after Daniel left without saying goodbye, Ruth returned to the bee shed with a flashlight. She did not look for the key where a wife would look. She looked where Eli would hide something from himself. Not in the desk, not in the bedroom, in the old smoker, the one she had never cleaned, the one that still smelled faintly of burlap, pine needles, and a season neither of them had survived whole. Inside, beneath a layer of cold ash, her fingers touched metal. Okay, small, blackened. Ruth stood alone in the shed with the key in her palm, while the first night bees moved unseen in the stone ditch behind her. For the first time since Eli died, she was afraid not that he had left too little behind, but that he had left enough. Ruth did not open the tin box that night. She set the key beside it on the kitchen table, turned off the overhead light, and sat in the dark while the refrigerator hummed and the house settled around her. For 6 years, she had begged for one more sentence from Eli, one more explanation, one more breath long enough to tell her why the hives mattered, why the stone ditch had to remain, why he had looked ashamed when he asked her to promise. Now the answer sat 6 inches from her hand, and Ruth was afraid of it. At dawn, Daniel came back. He did not knock. He had not knocked since he was a boy. He walked into the kitchen, saw the key, saw the box, and stopped. You opened it? No. Why? Ruth looked at the chair across from her. Because once I do, I can't go back to loving him the same way. Daniel stood still for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair and sat down. Maybe neither can I. That was when Ruth picked up the key. It resisted at first. The lock had rusted along the seam. Daniel brought oil from the truck and worked it into the keyhole with the patience of a man repairing something he did not want to break. When the lock finally turned, the sound was small. But to Ruth, it felt like a door opening under the whole valley. Inside the box were papers wrapped in waxcloth. The top sheet was a county copy, stamped Received March 18, 1997. Ruth knew the date before she read the rest. The collapse year. The report was titled, Preliminary Field Notes on Pollinator Disorientation Following Evening Spray Applications. Daniel leaned closer. Ruth read the first page slowly. Spray time. Wind condition. Bloom stage. Reported colony behavior. Foragers returning to incorrect boxes. Low circling. Failure to orient at dawn. Heavy losses near treated north edges. Not killed outright. Turned around. Eli's words. Harold's memory. The same thing Ruth had seen in the imported bees. Beneath the report was a list of names. Not dead people. Worse, in some ways. People whose lives had kept going after they lost the thing that fed them. Amos Reed, 214 colonies lost. Gutierrez Brothers, 391 colonies lost. Martha Klein Equipment liquidated. Bellamy Bees, 302 colonies affected. There were more. Ruth counted 19 small beekeeping operations. Some she had known, some she had forgotten, because forgetting was easier than remembering who disappeared from the Grange Hall one year and never came back. Daniel's face had gone pale. I didn't know it was that many. No, Ruth said. Neither did I. Under the list was a check stub. The amount was not huge by corporate standards, but Ruth remembered what it had bought. Daniel's hospital bill after pneumonia. 3 months of mortgage payments. Replacement lumber for the shed roof. Enough groceries to get through a season when Ruth had been too proud to ask anyone for help. The payee line read, Eli Belame. The memo line read, Settlement agricultural loss, no fault admission. Daniel pushed back from the table. No. Ruth did not speak. He stood, then sat again, as if his body could not decide whether to run from his father or toward him. He took money? Ruth touched the check stub with one finger. He kept us alive. That's not the same thing. No, Ruth said. It isn't. The next document hurt more. It was an agreement, 4 pages long, signed by Eli, a county witness, and Quan Bessenid from a company that no longer existed under the same name. Not Golden State Pollination, not exactly. A chemical distributor that had since been absorbed, renamed, purchased, and polished until the original stain was hard to find. But Ruth saw one familiar thread. Carla Mead's offer from Golden State used the same structure: payment, confidentiality, no public claim, no admission of fault. Daniel read until his eyes stopped moving. They paid him to shut up. Ruth closed her eyes. They paid him because he was desperate enough to listen. At the bottom of the box was a folded letter. Her name was written on it. Ruthie. No one else had called her that after Eli died. She opened it carefully. The letter was not long. Eli had never wasted words when shame was doing the work. He wrote that he had found the pattern too late to save the colonies. He wrote that he took the report to the county, believing the truth would help the other beekeepers. He wrote that by the time lawyers came, Daniel was sick, the mortgage was late, and Ruth had been making soup out of what was left in the pantry. He wrote, I told myself I was buying time. I told myself I would speak when we were steady again. But quiet gets easier the longer you practice it. Ruth pressed her hand to her mouth. Daniel looked away, but not before she saw tears standing in his eyes. Eli wrote that the settlement had not only bought silence, it had bought guilt. Every time another beekeeper sold out, he heard the hives go quiet again. Every time someone blamed mites or bad luck, he wanted to stand up and could not. So, he built the ditch higher. He marked the stones. He left scent roads where frightened bees might still find their way if the same mistake returned. If the almond trees ever bloom without sound, it means they learned nothing, Eli wrote. Don't protect me then. Protect the bees. Protect the ones who lost everything because I was too scared to stay poor one more year. Ruth made a sound then. Not asob. Something smaller. Something older. Daniel reached for the letter, then stopped. Can I? She handed it to him. He read the last paragraph twice. When he finished, he folded the letter along the same creases Eli had made 6 years before. For a while, neither of them spoke. The truth had not made Eli into a villain. That would have been easier. It made him human in the most painful way. A man who had known the right thing, failed to do it, and spent the rest of his life building a place where the truth might survive him. By noon, Ruth had called Amos. By 1 o'clock, he was sitting at her kitchen table with the list in both hands. The old beekeeper did not cry. His face hardened in pieces. My wife thought I ruined us, he said. She died thinking I mismanaged the bees. Ruth could not answer. Amos tapped the report with one thick finger. This would have changed that. That was the first consequence. A marriage had carried blame it did not deserve. Harold Carson came next, after Lily told him enough to make him drive over without waiting. He read the spray pattern notes and sat down heavily. I kept using them, he said. No one told you, Ruth said. I should have asked different questions. That was the second consequence. Growers had built years of decisions on a lie that had been called science because the truth was inconvenient. Marla Greer arrived near sunset. She came alone, without Len, without county folders, without the public face she wore at meetings. Ruth almost did not let her in. Then Marla said, My father's signature is on the old witness line, isn't it? Ruth opened the door. Marla read the agreement standing up. When she reached the last page, the color left her face. Her father, Howard Greer, had been Deputy Agricultural Commissioner in 1997. Ruth remembered him vaguely as a broad man with silver hair and a talent for shaking hands without promising anything. Marla set the agreement down. I grew up hearing that your husband was difficult, she said. My father said Eli Bellamy was one of those men who blamed everyone else when his business failed. Daniel's jaw tightened. Marla did not defend herself. I repeated that once, she said, at a grower's dinner, years ago. That was the third consequence. A man who had been guilty of silence had also been publicly reduced to a fool, so the people who buried the report could sleep easier. Ruth looked at Eli's letter. For 6 years, she had protected a clean version of her husband. Now the dirty truth in front of her did something strange. It did not make her love him less. It made the love heavier, harder to carry, more honest. Trent Voss called twice that evening. Ruth did not answer. Carla Mead emailed a revised offer with a higher number. Daniel saw it on Ruth's phone. For one flicker of a second, he looked at the amount. Then he turned the screen face down. Ruth noticed. So did he. "I still want you to be okay," he said. "I know, but not like that." Ruth looked at her son and saw, for the first time in days, not the boy hurt by the bee yard, not the man tempted by relief, but someone standing exactly where Eli had once stood. In front of money, in front of fear, in front of silence. This time, the choice had come back to the Bellamy kitchen. Ruth gathered the report, the list, the agreement, and Eli's letter. She placed them beside the black wax frame from the county meeting. Outside, the stone ditch held the last warmth of the day. A few bees moved low in the mint, returning before dark. Ruth watched them through the kitchen window. Then she said the words that made the house feel both emptier and stronger. "We're going to show everyone." Daniel nodded. Amos nodded. Lily, standing near the door with her phone in both hands, did not record the moment. Some truths did not need a camera yet. They needed witnesses. The emergency growers meeting was called for 7 o'clock the next morning. By 6:30, the parking lot outside the county agriculture building was already full. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the road. Men who had once laughed from folding chairs now stood in small groups without laughing at all. A few brought coffee. No one drank much of it. The almond bloom was entering its most dangerous week, and everyone in that lot understood that a crop could fail quietly before a county admitted it had been warned. Ruth arrived with Daniel on one side, and Amos Reed on the other. Lily followed behind them, carrying a cardboard box. Inside were Eli's report, the old agreement, the beekeeper loss list, the black wax frame, and 3 sample jars from the ditch. Ruth had slept only 2 hours. Her face looked pale under the morning light, but she walked straight. At the front door, Trent Voss was speaking to 2 growers in a low voice. When he saw the box in Lily's arms, his expression tightened. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, "I hope you understand that raw historical documents can be misleading without expert review." Ruth stopped beside him. "I spent 6 years believing half a sentence," she said. "I know exactly how misleading unfinished things can be." Then she walked inside. Commissioner Marla Greer was not in the room yet. That mattered. For most of the night, Marla had sat alone in her father's old study, reading the agreement with his signature at the bottom. Howard Greer had been dead for 9 years, but his desk still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and cedar polish. On the wall hung a photograph of him shaking hands at a harvest banquet, smiling the way public men smiled when they knew the camera would remember only the good side. Marla had grown up believing her father had kept the county steady. Then she read the report again. Then Eli's name. Then the witness line. Then the beekeeper loss list. She thought of Ruth standing at the microphone with that black frame. She thought of herself saying accusations were not appropriate. She thought of how easy it had been to sound official when the truth was sitting in a rusted box behind an old woman's shed. At dawn, Marla took her father's photograph off the wall. Not to punish him, to stop asking it for permission. When she entered the meeting room at 7:08, she carried no prepared statement. The room was packed. Growers stood along the walls. Len Farrow sat near the front with a county folder open. Trent and Carla Meade sat together at the right side of the room. Daniel stood behind Ruth's chair, one hand resting on the cardboard box. Marla looked smaller than usual when she reached the front. "I reviewed the documents last night," she said. Trent stood halfway. "Commissioner, Golden State requests that any discussion involving historical chemical distributors, current pollination operations, or alleged continuity between entities be handled through counsel." Marla looked at him. "Sit down, Mr. Voss." The room went very still. Trent sat. Marla placed the old agreement on the table. In 1997, this county received a preliminary field report from Eli Bellamy regarding pollinator disorientation following evening spray applications. That report was witnessed by a deputy agricultural commissioner. Her voice caught once. She did not hide it. "That deputy was my father." A murmur moved through the room. Marla continued. "The report was not distributed to affected beekeepers. It was not preserved in the public advisory file. A private settlement followed. I do not yet know everything that happened, but I know enough to say this county failed to protect the people who came to it with a warning." No one clapped. It was not that kind of moment. Amos Reed looked down at his hands. Harold Carson removed his cap. Ruth stared at the tabletop, not because she was weak, but because hearing the truth out loud made it heavier. Marla turned toward her. "Mrs. Bellamy," she said, I am sorry. Ruth looked up. Marla did not stop there. And I am sorry to every beekeeper who was told their loss was mismanagement, weather, mites, or bad luck when this county had reason to ask harder questions. Amos made a sound under his breath. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. Trent stood again. Commissioner, Golden State is not responsible for a decades-old county handling issue. We are prepared to assist with a professionally managed research response, provided Mrs. Bellamy's property can be secured and brought under proper oversight. Ruth finally rose. She was shorter than every man near the front of the room. Still, people leaned in to hear her. You offered to buy my land, she said. You offered to fix my roof. You offered enough money that my son couldn't sleep last night because part of him wanted me to take it. Daniel closed his eyes. Ruth reached back and touched his hand once. I don't blame him. Money sounds clean when you're tired. She turned back to the room. But your offer came with silence. Eli took money with silence once. It kept us alive, and it hurt people I knew. I won't do it again. Carla Mead whispered something to Trent. Ruth continued. The ditch stays open. The hives stay where they are. No company owns the root those bees remember. A grower near the wall asked, Then what do we do? Ruth looked at Harold. You stop spraying after dusk. You give the bees a clean return window. You restore the north ditch line. You plant cover strips where Eli marked them. You let the small growers use the refuge first, because they're the ones who can't survive another bad explanation. Trent gave a tight laugh. That is not a scalable plan. Lily spoke from the back. Neither was losing the crop. A few growers turned. Harold Carson stood slowly. I'll stop dusk spray on my blocks. Another grower said, If Carson does it, I'll try 3 nights. Then another. Not everyone. Not enough for a miracle, but enough for the room to change direction. Len Farrow cleared his throat. The county can suspend the hazard notice pending site review and supervised restoration. Marla nodded. I'll authorize that today. Daniel stepped forward then, surprising Ruth. I can repair the fence and the roof over the old shed, he said. But I'll need lumber. Harold said, I've got lumber. Amos said, I've got old frames that still hold clean wax. Lily lifted her phone. I can organize volunteers. Ruth almost told them no. For years, the bee yard had been hers because no one else wanted the burden. Now they were offering hands, and accepting help felt nearly as frightening as standing alone. Daniel leaned close. Let them, he said. So Ruth did. That afternoon, trucks came not to stare, but to unload. Fence posts, mint starts, clean water barrels, old frames, gloves, lumber, a coil of rope. Someone brought sandwiches. Someone else brought a handwritten map of spray blocks willing to pause after dusk. The empty hives did not look less old. The ditch did not look grand. The roof still leaked over Ruth's back bedroom. But by sunset, the first safe path had been marked from the stone pockets to the almond rows, and for the first time in many years, the sound behind Ruth's house did not belong only to memory. It was small. It was uneven. It was alive. By late summer, the Bellamy bee yard still looked old. That disappointed some people. They had expected transformation to look cleaner. New fences, fresh paint, a sign big enough for photographs, maybe a dedication ceremony with folding chairs, a microphone, and someone important saying words that sounded better than the years they had failed to act. Ruth did not want that. The hives stayed weathered, not neglected, not anymore. Daniel had replaced the rotten bottom boards, repaired the lids that leaked, and braced the rows that had begun to lean. But Ruth would not let anyone paint them all the same bright white. Bees don't need everything to look new, she told Lily. They need it to tell the truth. So the old boxes remained different from one another. Some white, some gray, some marked with faded numbers. Hive 12 still carried Daniel's childhood paint mark on one corner. Ruth touched it every morning before she checked the ditch. The county suspended the hazard notice permanently in July. Not because the problem had vanished, but because Marla Greer pushed through a new classification for the site, Bellamy Pollinator Refuge and Educational Trust. It was not owned by Golden State. It was not controlled by the county. It was held in a small land trust with 3 conditions, Ruth insisted on herself. No exclusive corporate contract. No evening spray within the marked return windows. And the old hives must remain facing east. Trent Voss resigned before the state inquiry opened. Carla Mead sent one final letter denying wrongdoing on behalf of Golden State, written in language so polished it reflected nothing. Ruth folded it into thirds and placed it in the same file as Eli's old agreement, not to keep score, to remember the shape of silence when it came dressed as professionalism. The legal work did not end quickly. It never did. The 1997 report was reopened. Families of small beekeepers began submitting statements. Amos Reed wrote one for his wife, though his hand shook so badly Daniel had to sit beside him and help hold the paper still. Harold Carson changed his spray schedule first. Others followed slowly, some out of conviction, some out of fear, some because the bloom numbers left them no room for pride. Cover strips appeared along orchard edges. Mint, mustard, clover, and native flowers returned in broken lines where bare dirt had once been treated like efficiency. The almond crop did not fully recover that year. That mattered. Ruth refused to let anyone turn the story into a miracle. Some blocks failed. Some families lost money. Some growers who had waited too long had to face what delay cost. But the north boundary near Ruth's land set better than expected, and the small growers who followed the refuge plan early survived the season. Sometimes survival was not dramatic. Sometimes it was enough fruit on the branch to keep a family from selling. Daniel repaired the roof in September, not with Golden State money. The lumber came from Harold. The labor came from three growers, Amos's nephew, Len Farrow, and Daniel himself. Lily brought sandwiches and filmed none of it because Ruth asked her not to. When the last shingle was nailed down, Daniel climbed off the ladder and stood in the yard, looking embarrassed by his own sweat. Ruth handed him a glass of water. "You didn't have to do all that today," she said. Daniel looked up at the roof, then toward the hives. "Yeah," he said, "I did." It was not an apology. It was better. That fall, Lily began coming every Saturday morning. At first, she came with questions written in a notebook. What temperature made bees return late? How long did wax hold scent? Why did mint matter? How could Ruth tell the difference between healthy silence and dangerous silence? Ruth answered some. Others, she made Lily learn with her hands. She taught her how to lift a frame without fear, how to stand beside a hive without demanding that the bees move around you, how to smell old wax and know whether it carried smoke, mildew, chemical sharpness, or home, how to place her palm against limestone after sunset and feel whether the stone had held enough warmth. "You're not just watching bees," Ruth told her. "You're watching what the land remembers." One cold morning, Ruth brought out Eli's veil. It had hung in the shed for years, stiff with age, the mesh patched in two places, the brim stained from sweat and smoke. Ruth held it for a long time before handing it to Lily. Lily did not take it right away. "Are you sure?" "No," Ruth said. Lily waited. Ruth smiled faintly. "But take it anyway." Lily accepted it with both hands. "Was he a good man?" she asked. Ruth looked toward the ditch. For years, that question would have had an easier answer. Now the answer had roots. "He was a man who did something wrong," Ruth said, "and then spent the rest of his life trying to leave a way back." Lily lowered her eyes to the veil. "Then we should use it right." "Yes," Ruth said, "we should." In spring, the first school group came to the refuge. 22 students in rubber boots followed Lily along the marked path, while Ruth sat on a folding chair near Hive 12. Daniel stood behind her, pretending he was only there to carry equipment. Marla Greer came too, not as a speaker, but as a volunteer, handing out printed copies of the new spray window guidelines. No plaque was unveiled. No ribbon was cut. Ruth preferred it that way. The lesson began when Lily asked the students to close their eyes. At first, they giggled. Then the orchard settled around them. Wind moved through the almond branches. A truck passed far down the road. Somewhere near the stone ditch, a low sound gathered itself from the mint and limestone, small at first, then fuller. Not loud. Never loud enough for people who only trusted machines, but alive enough for anyone willing to stand still. Ruth watched the children listen. She watched Daniel listening too. His face had changed over the year. The old tightness had not vanished, but it no longer owned him. He had stopped looking at the bee yard like a wound that would not close. Now he looked at it like a scar that had finally learned to speak. A bee lifted from the ditch and crossed toward the old hives. It touched the entrance board of Hive 12, walked across the faded mark Daniel had painted as a boy, then rose toward the blossoms. Ruth followed it until the white flowers swallowed it. For a moment, she thought of Eli, not as a saint, not as a sinner, as a man standing somewhere between fear and courage, leaving stones behind because he could not leave truth any other way. Ruth placed one hand on the arm of her chair. The valley had called the hives empty once. Maybe they had been. But emptiness, Ruth had learned, was not always the end of a thing. Sometimes it was the space where memory waited for sound to return. And that morning, under the almond blossoms, the sound returned. Small, patient, alive.